This very old man, this couple sitting with such quiet dignity, this mother with her child, all are Americans of Japanese descent. So too is the rest of this audience, which here listens with solemn pride as the Army honors their sacred dead. Japanese American soldiers killed in action. Afterwards, a wife who has lost her husband is presented with the Silver Star. A father receives the Distinguished Service Cross. His son was killed in Italy, where he and thousands of other Japanese Americans, including the son of this woman, have produced one of the most remarkable combat records of the war. Important and decisive battles. And each time, these men of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Combat Team have been right out in front. Here, after bitter fighting, they enter Livorno, one more ill-fated town that has been pounded into rubble, as the Fifth Army makes its slow, tortuous advance up the hot, dry valleys of Italy. Already within the buildings, the dead have begun to stink, as the men deploy cautiously, wary of enemy snipers that have been left behind. And the Nazis, when they're rounded up, are plenty surprised. Suspicious of their own propaganda, Hans believes he's begun to fight Japan, too. Fritz thinks that maybe these GIs are Chinese troops, recently transferred to the Italian front. The casualties are returned to field hospitals. The seriously wounded immediately undergo emergency operations. While this GI, lying under a tent, has already begun his period of convalescence. Outside, the men walk around, read, talk, and anxiously await the day when they will go back into action. Sometimes they don't wait. But pulling an AWOL in reverse, they join their companies on the battlefield before their wounds are completely healed. Sounds crazy? Well, maybe. But these men don't think so. They've got a reason for being one of the top outfits in this war, as one of them testifies.
I'm from Seattle. After war was declared, I was evacuated from the Pacific Coast. When the call came for volunteers for a combat team, I volunteered from a relocation center to show my loyalty and to prove that I had the right to live as a good American citizen.
That's pretty much the story of all these men. Born in Hawaii or on the Pacific Coast, they've grown up and gone to school in Honolulu, Pomona, Los Angeles, San Jose. They've played football, visited drive-ins, gone to the movies at night. Their memories are the memories of all Americans, as the paper airplanes which they make for these Italian kids so clearly proves. At the same time, these men are also aware of the great prejudice against them because of the war in the Pacific. They know that there are people back home who make no distinction between them and the Japs we have fought at Tarawa, Saipan, and the Philippines. That's why these men originally volunteered, and why for 11 long months now, they've been in continuous combat. They've wanted to prove to other Americans how wrong it is to judge a man by the pigment of his skin or the shape of his eyes. A soldier can fight better as a free man with a belief in God than he can as a slave with a belief in the imperial Japanese religion of Shintoism.
Lieutenant O'Hara, your battalion has done a wonderful job in this Italian campaign. What are your reasons for fighting?
I'm fighting over here for the better things of life and to preserve the American way of living.
After their gear is once more in order, the men of the 100th Infantry Battalion march to where they are to receive a citation from General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army. General Clark, as he will tell you, is of Irish-English descent. Many of our GIs who once fought against the Italians are of Italian descent. Thousands of our men now fighting on the Western Front are of German descent. But as in the case of these Japanese, they are no less Americans, ready to fight for their country and their belief in democracy.
All of you Americans of Japanese descent have a right to be proud today. You have demonstrated true Americanism and true American citizenship on the field of battle. You have realized the necessity of coming to this distant land and leaving your homes and your loved ones in order that you could destroy this enemy who would take from you the American way of life and the freedoms which we value so highly in America. You have another right to be proud, for you have reached the high standards of American fighting men. You are always willing to close with the enemy. He has no bluff on you, and you've always defeated him. And let me tell you again, the 34th Division is proud of you, the 5th Army is proud of you, America is proud of you. And I know that whatever future action you go into, you will conduct yourselves with glory and bring about the peace that we are entitled to. Good luck to you, and God bless you.
On November 7th, 1944, the people left by war in this small Massachusetts town went to the polls and voted in a national election, very much as people in the United States have voted since the election of George Washington in 1789. The old ballot box in the town courthouse had ticked off votes for Cleveland and Harrison and McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. The memories of some of the older voters reached far enough back in time to recall how the power of a popular vote had shaped their way of life. A voter in Maryland had once been sold as a slave. A full-blooded Indian could remember the opening of the West. An old man in a Los Angeles park talked about the year 1864 when ballot boxes were brought up to the front lines in the Civil War. 1944 was the second time in our country's history that American voters were soldiers in the field. GIs cast an American ballot and took an American oath in rickety orderly room shacks all over the world. It made you wonder about Election Day back home. And November 7th, 1944 was a good day for remembering the streets of America. You couldn't miss the purpose of the day if you were there. Liquor dealers slept late. Everybody worked to get out the vote, and all of it built up to something like the excitement before a big game, where the outcome is in the dark, and the stakes are a way of life. Beyond that point where electioneering stops, there was some of the freest air to breathe that there has ever been. Standing in the sun on the safe streets of their towns, the American voters in 1944 knew that wars can begin in polling places. Wartime shortages and priorities had turned the clock back for transportation, and some of the means of travel on the roads that day had taken voters to the polls for the election of Woodrow Wilson. There's never been anything pretentious about the looks of the places where you cast your vote. Firehouses, laundries, buildings as different as the ways of life and the kinds of country we have. served as polling places for the people of the United States to make a decision that will be respected in the conference halls of London, Paris, Moscow, and eventually in the ruins of Berlin and Tokyo. The enemies of democracy have always claimed that a people as independent in their sympathies, as varied in their origins and religious beliefs as the people of America, can never choose a leader for themselves. Instead of these orderly lines, the enemies of democracy predicted riots and disorders at the polling places in 1944. Instead of a record-breaking registration, the enemies of democracy predicted apathy or disinterest or no election at all. Name, Helen Shaw. Occupation, secretary. Race, income, none of the rest of it matters. Name, Louis Stone. Occupation, actor. Occupation, housewife and mother. Occupation, farmer. Occupation, actress. Occupation, manicurist, elevator operator, florist, clerk, steam fitter. Occupation, shipyard worker. Name, Bob Hope, USO entertainer, and on November 7th, a free voter in the United States. Voters tracked alkali dust from Texas into the polling places, Georgia red clay, New England gravel, soot from Pittsburgh sidewalks, California sand, and New York dirt. A lot of votes were cast by people living in trailer camps and crowded rooming houses, brought to strange towns by the demand for war workers. But the ballot count kept rising, threatening to top the 1942 total of 28 million before noon. And late in the afternoon, at the end of their shift, shipyard workers headed directly from the yard gates to the polls. Gamblers were giving odds on Roosevelt, but no one else would make a prediction. When the lights began to go on in New York, forecasters still looked to the closest popular vote in recent history. In Times Square, barricades were knocked together to protect the store windows from the crowds that were already bunching up on street corners, waiting to get the returns from the traveling sign on the Times building, waiting to breathe in some of the excitement of the big night. At 6 o'clock, returns began to come in from the small towns in the north. It looked like the biggest registration on record, and before the day was over, 50 million ballots would be counted. Towns in Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont showed a marked Dewey trend. As soon as the ballots had been tabulated, the score went out on the wire, and first-string radio announcers began to take over the microphones. In New York, Bob Trout began a broadcasting stint that would last until breakfast. Counted soldier votes ran about parallel to the civilian choice, showing that the opinions of the GIs and the people back home were the same. Dewey took an early lead in Connecticut and Missouri. Voters in Italy heard that Roosevelt was leading in Arizona. France heard that Dewey was ahead in Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, and Kansas. California, Georgia, Connecticut, Delaware were going to the president. Arizona, Alabama, Idaho, Illinois followed. Most Americans stayed at home and close to the radio after supper. At 9:30, Vice President Wallace predicted a Roosevelt victory, leading the other forecasters by a good 3 hours. At 10 o'clock, Pittsburgh's Allegheny County turned in a lead for Roosevelt, upsetting Republican predictions in a vital state. And from then on in, the president began to gather the lead that brought him victory. It was a cold, clear night in New York. The You could hear the shouting of the crowds for 15 blocks in either direction. Picked up by the airwaves, you could hear them above the noise of the rain in Hütgen Forest. And you could hear them on the China airstrips, where the B-29s were warming up for the blow at Tokyo. They were cheering the victory of their candidate, and they were living proof that government, even in a time of war, can be a question of conscience and not a matter of force.